I think the last few people are just coming in, and then we'll make a start. So yeah, thanks for coming to see this talk. There's loads and loads of real good ones here, so choosing this one, yes, it's good to get to present the sort of stuff that we've been doing. I've got some bad news though. I was trying to use my Switch controller to do it because I thought it was quite fun, but it won't connect. So obviously the demo gods are against us, so we'll have to do it a bit more old school than that. But yeah, there we go. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Nick Hills. I work for a company called True Clarity over in Bristol in the UK. We've been doing Sitecore builds for probably about 10 years now. And one of our biggest clients is EasyJet. And they're quite an interesting one because they have to deal with a lot of customers, a lot of people buying flights, huge numbers of transactions a second and all that kind of thing. So hopefully what we'll go through today is a bit of background, how we've sort of taken on going from being developers, i.e. knowing how to write cycle code, through to actually owning the entire deployment process, the DevOps process, making sure that the site doesn't go down and we get rather awkward phone calls talking about how much money they've not been able to take for the last short amount of time. So yeah, hopefully what you'll get from this is that I genuinely believe Sitecore developers are very, very good at this sort of thing. We came into this without really a huge amount of experience in how to do support 24/7, how to monitor a system in the detail that we really needed to. A lot of the things that have been mentioned here, you'll probably hear the term ARM templates mentioned. And before kind of doing this whole process and piece, I didn't really know what that meant. And hopefully going through the talk, by the end of it, you guys will have a bit of a better view of what that sort of thing means. We'll then look at a few examples of just the sorts of things that you can do. It's not going to be in any huge detail, but some of the things that you might end up scripting as you're doing this sort of process. And there are some GIFs, so hopefully that will make up for the fact that there's not too many demos, because yeah, these sorts of things I don't think are great for demoing. So probably, I think about 2 years ago, we started this process. EasyJet hosted everything that they were doing on premise, and that worked. We could handle kind of the load that we were dealing with at the time. But what we've been doing sort of alongside that is bringing all of their checkout process essentially into Sitecore. And so we're dealing then with a lot more load. We're dealing with the challenges of deployments where you've got loads and loads of people buying, ultimately buying products at the same time. In the production setup we're dealing with, it is actually all AWS, and so I know that goes a bit against the sort of mantra of some of the Azure stuff that we've seen earlier, but I think a lot of the concepts, they're pretty common. You'll see similarities between the two providers. So for our production stack that we're dealing with, we've got 12 Sitecore instances, and I mean they're handling hundreds and hundreds of transactions a second. This is a bigger scale than we'd ever dealt with before. So I mean, it was a very interesting thing to sort of see this happening. And the slightly scarier bit is they take millions through this a day. I mean, upwards of 15 million through the checkout process. So even small amounts of downtime is a real no-no. It's a pretty scary prospect. So I think I feel like this guy's pretty good representation of people learning development. I'm sure he's probably writing better code than maybe I've done at points, but there you go. You start as a .NET developer. You leave, well, in my case, I left university, went into learning about development work. So suddenly this sort of concept of doing DevOps, it was a bit of a different ballpark, really. I hadn't been taught it. It was kind of, you have to learn that sort of thing on your own. But I think, well, persevering with it, it really, hopefully, has worked out. It's proved to be a very fulfilling, and the sort of concepts that you apply to your development, your clean codes, the way you might want to structure things, it's exactly the same. Ultimately you're solving problems, but you're just doing it in a slightly different space. Now, this is quite a common issue that I think we see, and the JavaScript world introduces frameworks left, right, and center. I think you see that quite commonly. As you start to dig into these tools and the way that the different providers offer up their sort of services, there's always something new coming. There's always harder, stronger, faster next version that will solve all your problems. Now, I mean, that sometimes is the case, but often there won't be this silver bullet that will basically get you out of jail. Try and find something that works for you and just keep it simple. You don't need to over-design all these processes, because really you're just trying to deploy some code up to a web server. So I think my argument here is going to be why are developers a good choice for doing this sort of thing? So they're going to be the people that have written the features. They're going to be the people that understand the code and how it works. They're going to be the ones that ultimately know how Sitecore works. And I think probably if that's not the case, then there's maybe, well, there's probably more options than this, but these will get you started. Either go on the training, or in the UK, we've got the job centre. So there you go, that could be your fallback. In this talk earlier, we saw quite a lot of information where they were showing what Sitecore might look like in Azure. That model holds true whichever cloud provider you're dealing with. The two slightly bluey boxes here kind of represent Sitecore back in the old days. So if we think back to kind of pre-XDB, you're talking about web servers and you're talking about SQL servers. And ultimately, that's it. You don't need to really worry too much more than that sort of thing. Obviously now, since the incarnation of XDB and the way things are moving forwards, that's shifting towards things like Mongo and Solr and that sort of thing. But let's not forget, it is quite a simple setup if you want it to be. You've got IIS, which pretty much comes with Windows Server without you really needing to do much. And then you need SQL Server. That's a relatively commodity entity now. As you sort of start on this process, there's all these terms that you'll come across. And this is only a tiny smattering of the sorts of things you'll run into. Don't worry about the fact that all of these things exist. As you start to iterate the process, it's much like development. You won't suddenly go into your dev sprints or however you choose to do it, whether it's waterfall or agile or anything like that, and try and come up with this huge super solution from the get-go. You need to start small and iterate, and that exact process holds very true for this kind of thing. Start simple. Find the tools, try the tools. Some of them you don't even need to do any coding for. So if you go down things like the Octopus route and things like TeamCity, it's more a configuration exercise. It's not, you're not writing C#, you're not writing PowerShell, you're not doing anything like that. Now, one thing we got caught out by, luckily this was quite a long time ago and it wasn't nearly as high profile a site as EasyJet, but for some reason our TeamCity broke. And we couldn't deploy, and something went wrong on the site. And having someone stood over your shoulder, sort of, I guess, criticizing the fact that this is happening is not a very nice place to be. I'd much rather be able to tell them, well, okay, we've got either a resilient system built or we've got backup. So if you do go down that route of using Octopus or TeamCity, just make sure you back it up. Yeah, it's not a good place to be if you haven't. If you're doing anything that involves kind of lots of repeated processes, so this might be setting up new kit, setting up boxes, installing things, configuring or pulling files down from Amazon or Azure Blob Storage, anything like that, you'll probably find that you need to start dealing with PowerShell. So start learning about it. It's very, very similar sort of concept to .NET. You can deal with .NET assemblies, you can write your own custom C# functions if you really need to, but yeah, get stuck into PowerShell because you'll find it will really help you. So I quite like this little animation here. I think it's quite a good metaphor really for this sort of thing. So the goalie, I think he's cracked it. He's made the save and the penalty's not happened, and then yeah, it goes in. Things will change over time. Don't necessarily expect yourself to be finished at the point you can press go and your site gets deployed. Like you'll add more pages, you'll add more sites. I mean, Sitecore's brilliant for accommodating all of that. It makes life very, very easy to create microsites or extra nodes within the tree that represent anything that you want to, really. You might find that you need more servers because you're getting more traffic. You might find suddenly you've got a sale on and you need spikes. You're expecting spikes of traffic, so you need more kit available to you. So all these sorts of things mean that essentially your deployment Entities will need to change and will grow and will shift. Sometimes you might find you actually need less servers. You might have overspec things, and you won't be finished. You'll get to a point where things are working, but think of it like development stories. There'll always be more to look at. So for EasyJet, this has been happening for about 2 years, and we've constantly changing things. We're shifting the way we use databases around. We're adding in Elasticsearch to certain bits. We're using Lambda to do things that we maybe didn't before. And it's all out there and actually quite good fun to learn. So if you're coming up with a process or a new way of deploying things, I think the sort of mantra or view that we were trying to get to was you'd have this big red button and you could slam it on the desk and the deployment would happen and all this kit would get spun up and life was really simple. And you start to think about that in, well, maybe you need to add a few more parameters to that, because it's not one big red button, doesn't necessarily fit all. Which environment are you deploying to? Are you dealing with your prod environment, your QA, your UAT? Are you doing your blue or green deployment? Are you doing just Sitecore? Are you doing delivery? Are you doing authoring? Are you doing processing bits? Are you pushing it to region A, pushing it to region B? So all of these things kind of combine into making this one big red button, probably a series of buttons, or at least a combination of the parameters. In the Azure talk, they showed the way Sitecore are approaching that, and I think that's really neat. They would take you through a little workflow where you could pick kind of these sorts of things, how big the deployment's going to be. Is it your prod one? Is it the blue one? Or which slot are you going to? And that sort of thing. What we've done for EasyJet is we've built a set of tools in WPF. They don't look hugely pretty. That wasn't really the goal of them. But we can use them to see exactly what we've got running in all of our different environments, in which colors. We can use it to concoct different deployments. So the screenshot on the right, here we can choose environments. We can choose the fact that we're deploying just Sitecore or we're just deploying the APIs we run. We can choose whether we push it to just Dublin or to Dublin and Frankfurt and all that sort of thing. So as we start to build this up, really what we're doing is we're just generating a set of PowerShell scripts. And I suspect the way that Azure is handling the new Sitecore combination of templates, it's doing a pretty similar thing. It's aggregating this information together and then giving you something that you can run. Now, it's a blue-green deployments has been sort of talked around quite a lot today, and it's actually probably the best part of redoing this entire process has been the fact we've been able to add this in. And if people don't know quite what it means, hopefully the Azure talk earlier at least explained some of it, but you've got the ability to push up an entire production deployment, test it in isolation, and then finally when you're happy, you can flip users to it. So whether that's done through DNS or various other means, that's down to you, how you want to do it. Now, it's interesting, in the talk earlier, they did mention dealing with databases, and they sort of glossed over it a little bit. Apologies if they're in here, it's not a dig, it's just, it's a hard part of or at least something that you've got to consider, that if you're pushing up an entire copy of your production stacks, then you've got your master database and your web databases that will contain almost a state of things, so it's kind of stateful in that way. So as part of the sort of swing, and we'll see how this works in shortly, you need to take a copy of that. So whether that be a backup and restore if you're dealing with SQL in that form, or if you're scripting against, actually, for example, the Azure API, then you can control that database flow. The impact of that is, for the sort of front-end users, probably pretty minimal, because you'll be making sure that you've got your whole green stack ready, including your web tier, and then gradually you bring people onto it. It does mean that, for example, for the editors, there may be a bit of downtime, that they might have to deal with the fact that the master database is being backed up and copied. But yeah, hopefully, as you start to investigate and take on this approach, those sorts of things might help. Sorry, just a sec. Right. Decided to try and do updates just midway through, so that's good of Windows, but hopefully we're right. There's a few other benefits that you can get from blue-green deployments. That if you've got a blue stack, you've got a capacity of 500 transactions a second, for example. So if you create a green stack, you've got 1,000. So we know, for example, that there's certain points in the year where sale period comes, when EasyJet release all these new routes. And suddenly we see the traffic go from really high to even more than that. So one thing we've done in the past is we've had blue and green running, and we just split the load across them all. Now, there are disadvantages there. It's a bit more awkward about how you make content changes. So what we tend to do is consider a bit of a content freeze just for that period. It'll be a day or two. But the sort of reckoning is it's better to have the ability to handle all this load rather than the site go down. If they do need to make content changes, you might have to do it twice because you're doing it in your blue and green stacks. But ultimately, we're in a better place, I think. Other things we've done to sort of handle that sort of problem, we just stop the boxes, turn them up a notch or two. So in AWS, we kind of move them up through the bandings that you've got, and then ultimately we've got more capacity. So the story with Azure and the Sitecore demos are often talking about this a lot, and it's a very, very cool and very integrated tool, which is Application Insights. We heard the guys earlier mention it, and it's very much part of the portal. You don't really have to work outside of it. Now, because we're dealing with Amazon, we don't have Application Insights. So what we've gone for is a tool called Datadog, and it does a very similar thing. It aggregates all the information that you might have in AWS. So this is things like the CPU on the boxes, how many requests are your load balancers, how much disk you've got left. All these kind of things just get pulled in automatically, and then you can set up alerts based on them. You can set up dashboards with graphs showing all the stuff. Interestingly, though, you can also push out your own statistics to it. So we make lots and lots of API calls. We get a lot of our pricing data from EasyJet's backend systems. So we can monitor over time how long these API calls take. And if we suddenly see spikes in those, we know the problem actually lies maybe with the EasyJet end, not necessarily with us. If you are doing this sort of setting up any kind of deployments and you're pushing different versions of code around, make sure you know which version of code is in different places. Make sure it's easy to find it out, because if you're dealing with more than probably like 3 or 4 environments, it can be easy to lose track of it. So just keep a log of possibly what change set you're dealing with, not only of the code, but also, if you can, the database, and also the tools you've used. So chances are you'll be kind of version controlling the tools that you've made to do this sort of thing. Now, one thing I quite like about what we've done with this is that we actually let our graduate developers, so these are people that are straight out of uni, come in and do our production deployments for us. Not to remove the burden from us, that's by no means the intent, although it is quite nice not having to do deployments all the time. The reason that we feel confident we can do this is we use exactly the same process within QA as we do in UAT, as we do in production. And so the problems that you tend to hit, you'll find them in all those different tiers, and you'll know how to handle that sort of thing. One of the slightly frustrating things you do sometimes hit with the cloud, and Azure, I think, maybe has these problems, but this is talking about AWS, is you get this insufficient server resources. Ultimately, Amazon is saying at that point in time, they haven't necessarily got enough kit for you to deploy into for the size boxes you want. Now, shouldn't be a massive showstopper. Just wait 10 minutes and try it again. And if your process can absorb that and you don't worry about it, then don't get scared by it. This, I think, is possibly one of my favorite gifts that I've managed to find on the internet. I think the only thing that would make it better is if there was some little paperclip offering some advice just before he does it. So yeah, if you're using the same tools for everything, make sure that you can't just do delete production, because you're going to get a pretty heavy bollocking, I think, if you do that by mistake. There's all sorts of different ways you can do it, whether you do it in different accounts, giving people access keys that only allow certain people to do production deploys, whether you build extra prompts into the process. All of these sorts of things will help. So just be careful about how you handle it. So I think this is quite an interesting question. And so which cloud provider do you choose? There's the two, well, there's several out there, but I think the two that come up in conversation quite a lot, at least for the Sitecore space, are Amazon and Azure. So which do you pick? And sometimes that could be down to personal preference or the company that you're working with's policy. And that's how we ended up going with AWS, that this is what EasyJet were doing for all of their stacks and for all their other deployments. So we fitted into that. Now, I think if you were going down the sort of Sitecore purist route, Azure would be the clear option to jump at, because all of the support that Sitecore are building up at the moment and the templates and everything like that are all geared up for working with Azure. So we've had to code up a lot of this stuff from scratch because ultimately it didn't really exist in the Amazon world. So, I mean, it's down to you, really. You can pick. Both offer very, very similar things for what you need to do. So, yeah, I'd suggest it's you guys have to make that decision. Again, there's other, once you've picked your provider, there's different options to choose for how you deal with things like your databases, your Mongos, even down to your web boxes now with the sort of web app stuff we saw before. There are some niceties about not really having to deal with SQL backups or SQL resilience or all those sorts of things. Hand that over to the provider and they do all the sort of dirty work for you. There will probably be a cost with that the SQL license has to kind of exist somewhere. So ultimately that's probably being absorbed in the service that you're using. But yeah, it's down to you. When we started this process, there was the offering of RDS, which is something that Amazon have. It didn't seem like there was that great support for it from Sitecore themselves. So what we went with is IaaS boxes. So we actually host SQL Server ourselves, and we do the backups ourselves. So every 2 hours, we back up all our SQL databases and push them up to S3. That's really quite useful because then when we come to do our blue-green deployments, we've already got the backups already in place, so we can then just make use of them. The cloud can kind of appear this really good thing that you've got all this like capacity that you can start to play with. You can design all the networks from scratch. You can add disks left, right, and center, and anything that you want to do is available. The more you add, the more stuff costs. Everything seems to come with a cost. Just be careful that someone involved in this process has got a good credit card assigned to your account, because you don't want to be in the position that your site goes down because someone's not paid the bill. That's going to be a pretty embarrassing sell if it does happen. There are a few things that you can do to kind of reduce the cost of stuff. So Amazon has this concept of reserved instances, and that's your way of kind of reserving or bagsying the certain size or number of boxes that you want. Now, it does come with some disadvantages that it's slightly harder to change then. So you're not necessarily, you may be bought into something that might be evolving over time. So they help some situations, but yeah, be careful. We're not using those at the moment because we're still changing our infrastructure so much. What we do to save some money in our non-production account is we just turn everything off at night and then turn it back on in the morning. It's pretty simple scripts to run, and we actually use some Lambda functions, which is a sort of serverless concept, and yeah, it's very easy to do. The deployment is one thing. So you've got getting your kit actually provisioned is one part of the process. You've then got actually installing what you want on there as the sort of secondary part. Now, I haven't actually used Azure in a huge amount, so hopefully this sort of thing will be getting a lot quicker. But based on what we find with Amazon, it takes us probably about 20 minutes from press and go to the boxes actually being running. And then we have to do our installation setup. So all in all, we expect a production deployment, provided it goes to plan, will take about 40 minutes. There is Docker support in both providers. That was a bit sort of new for when we started doing this. Docker was quite early, so we didn't think that we weren't quite ready to absorb it into the process. But it's something that's sort of potentially in the pipeline, but yeah, watch this space. We did find that 40 minutes is quite a long time. So if you're doing QA deploys again and again, and the guys are having to wait 40 minutes to test out a new feature, that's quite a long time. So what we've done is we've built a slightly varied process to this, where we don't kill off the kit and recreate it. We just push new code up to the same boxes. We only do that in QA, though. We don't want people to start becoming reliant on it, because ultimately it's different to what production's doing, and we want production to be this real mirror the rest of it. All right. So ARM templates and CloudFormation. Does anyone heard or not heard of these before? Has anyone heard of them? Cool. So a few. And I mean, I have to confess, when I started, I had no idea what these things meant. I heard them mentioned at talks, and people sort of went into them, but I didn't really know exactly what they did. We'll look at CloudFormation first, and then we'll have a look at Azure's offering, because it's very, very similar. There's a few things you can use with them. You have things like parameters. So this is when you install the template, you can choose, I want to push it to QA, or I want to push it to UAT, or I want to push the green deployment app. You can then set up things like mappings. So a mapping might say, because I'm deploying to QA through the parameter we pushed in, I therefore want to use this network topology, or I want to pick this VPC to install to, or I want to use these subnets, or these disks, or anything like that. You can then use conditions. So this gives you the freedom to almost create if statements based off the parameters you've got. Now, from the experiences we've had, they work quite well, but they're a bit mucky. You end up having to write quite verbose and quite long script blocks or JSON blocks to achieve certain things. So we've moved that logic somewhere else, and I'll just touch on that later on. And then finally, you've got your resources. So resources define pretty much everything about what's getting deployed. Your boxes, your networks, the disks, the load balancers, the IPs, the DNS entries, you name it. You can do all that ultimately through this sort of thing. It does have a UI, a sort of drag and drop way of doing it. Personally, I wouldn't go with this. It's a bit like using Dreamweaver's design view for making a website. It hopefully at least shows the fact that we've got all sorts of different things in here. We've got web boxes, we've got SQL boxes, we've got placement groups. Yeah, you name it, it's up there. So the Azure approach is very similar. This is just a screenshot from Sitecore's GitHub, where they host all these ARM templates you can use. And again, it holds similar things. You pass in parameters, and you can make use of those throughout the rest of the process. And I think what's quite nice that Sitecore have done is they take a lot of that away from you. You don't really need to worry about pushing all the data around. It's something that we had to do, which meant we had a real good understanding of exactly what was going on. There are, I think, some really nice things that you get with this sort of approach. That you install a template, and you get 25 web boxes spun up, and your entire production kit is up there and running. You delete this template, and all of that gets pulled down. So you need to be careful you delete the right one, which maybe is a con, or I guess it's just the way that they work. You can source control them, so you can see all the changes. They're JSON. That's pretty easy to spot diffs in and all that kind of thing. They are pretty verbose, though. You have to write, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of lines of JSON to achieve actually some quite simple things. One of ours is about 3,000 lines of code, or 3,000 lines of JSON. So there's a lot to them. And the syntax and the way that the different providers use them means that you have to, if you're swapping between the two, they're a bit different. Auto-scaling is another option you've got in this sort of setup. That you can choose to add more web boxes at any point if you're going down that sort of route. In the talk earlier, they showed, I think, the sliders that you can basically just pump up the power, and you've suddenly got more boxes available to you. So that's a really nice thing. I think the risk of that, having loads and loads of web nodes can handle lots of requests, but behind the scenes, you've got to have databases that can handle lots of requests, and you've got to have Mongo that's available and ready to handle that sort of load. So it's worth just considering the fact that sliding a scale up in a portal or adding more boxes on the fly isn't necessarily going to solve all your problems. You're kind of moving the issue maybe around. So yeah, do some load testing if you can, and be aware that databases do have this limited throughput. For EasyJet, we tried to keep actually what happens as simple as we could, really. We've got the BlueStack running. So like we touched on, we back up the production databases. This is happening every 2 hours, or we can do it on demand. And that's quite a simple thing to do. It's basically normal SQL commands that you run. And then these get uploaded into S3. This is now down at our developer machines. We compile it. That's got to be done. And then we upload a zip of that to S3. and do the same sort of thing with some scripts we run. So at the point that the boxes fire up, we choose to run a set of PowerShell scripts, and that will be doing things like configuring IS. It will be installing MSIs for your antivirus. It will be stopping Windows services, doing things and then starting them again, all that sort of thing. And then finally, we aggregate the information we need for our CloudFormation templates, and then we install it. So then we're handing over actually into AWS and the box startup. So we pull down the code, we pull down the databases, we unzip it, run the scripts, and we start testing things. So now we've got this green stack that's a total copy, and once we're happy with that, we can then flip the DNS around. So the way we do that sort of thing is with Akamai. We use the GTM weightings to gradually ease people from one color to the other. And you can kind of do that 10% at a time. Once you're a bit happier, 20, 50, and then you're all the way there. Now, the cloud, I mean, it's brilliant. You get, in theory, huge resiliency throughout. But what we have found, though, like stuff eventually sometimes does go awry. When there was the Dyne DNS issue, I think about 6 months ago, bits of Amazon were affected, and therefore we had problems. You find that the actual host boxes that you're running on sometimes will be getting patched. Sometimes, for some reason, Frankfurt Availability Zone B is doing something slightly odd. It's good because we can see this happening because we've got our monitoring in place. And sometimes what we've done is we just kill off that pod. We just delete all the boxes involved, create them again, and keep an eye on the problem. If it keeps happening, we find we just pull traffic off there a little bit using Akamai. The advantages we can get with the SQL are using something called dedicated tenancy instances. And this is your way of saying to Amazon, I want to keep this almost like in its own reserved little space. So it costs more because obviously you're ring fencing your setup a little bit, but it should mean that ultimately anyone noisy neighbors aren't going to affect your SQL server. When this Dyne DNS issue did happen, it was interesting. Some of the API calls we made into AWS actually started failing. So this was, for example, we would be saying, what are my sibling web instances? Because we might need to find out some information about them. There's a really good library that you can get for free that these slides mention, and that's the Poly library. Now that has things built into it, things like retry logic, timeouts, things like circuit breakers. Those sorts of patterns make it very easy to then make it a lot more resilient. If your calls are failing, then it will just wait a little bit and try again. And you can configure all of this in code. So I definitely advise taking that on if you're using that sort of thing. There's quite a cool feature that we're starting to see more prevalent now, I think. And that's this concept of cloud functions. You can use it, well, in Lambda is the AWS version, and Azure Functions is the Azure incarnation. So these can be C#, they can be JavaScript, they can be other languages, but those two are probably the ones that at least we use. And they can then be triggered on a schedule. So think of them a bit like the Windows services you used to maybe write to clean up a disk or to do those sorts of things. They can run at a very, very small cost and actually can be very useful. So we use them for monitoring all the backups are happening. It's all well and good that you think you're taking backups periodically, but if they're not in the bucket that you expect them to, when you come to rely on them, then yeah, you don't want to be in that position. So we'll have a look at a few little examples of some of the things we're doing. They're screenshots, apologies, it's not actual code, but I think hopefully these summarize some of the things that you can do. So at the top, we've got the AWS version. So if you're in CloudFormation, if you want to hand over to PowerShell or run commands from the command line, that top line is all you need to do. From once you've got that PowerShell exe in, you're then in the PowerShell world. Similarly, if you're in Azure, you can do the same sort of thing with command to execute. If you want to pull files down from S3, you've got this one PowerShell command. The parameters hopefully will relatively self-explanatory. It's basically what bucket you want to pull it from, what the file's called, and where you want to put it. And similarly, if you're in the Azure world, yeah, there's other ways to do it. If you want to install, for example, the IIS rewrite module, then there you go. This sort of script, there's not much to it. So, I mean, what I'm hoping to demonstrate with this sort of thing is the scripts we're running are all actually quite small. It's not a really busy or long process. It's just doing lots of little bits, and they're all quite simple and reusable. Similarly, if you want to start a Windows service, there you go. It's as simple as that. We've touched on code, and we touched on databases. So I think there's one last piece of the puzzle. You have to make Sitecore changes. That's basically what deployments will need to look like. So there's tools you can use. You can TDS, your unicorns, and things like that. So which one ultimately is better? And I'm not really going to try and answer that, because I think it comes down to, again, personal preference, which one fits better for your use cases. Before deciding on that, I think it's worth just drawing attention to this, that you've got content, and content owned by the editors, and that's typically stuff under Sitecore content and the media library and that sort of thing. And then you've got content that's owned by developers, and that's rendering definitions or rendering items, stuff under system, and obviously all your templates. So not necessarily one size fits all. The way you think of developer content and content editor content, I think, needs to be handled differently. The sorts of things we use to sort of decide basically which approach we would take were kind of hinged off a few criteria. How easy is it to build up the change set you're dealing with? I mean, you might find Sitecore packages give you everything you need to. That does work, but they're a bit of a pain to build. They're a bit of a pain to sort of remember which ones you've installed in different places, and source control and that sort of thing. What happens when merge conflicts happen? If anyone understands the different drop-down options you get when you install them, then you probably are a Sitecore guru, I think. It's voodoo, some of it, in my opinion. So the way that we take this on, and interestingly, there was someone I chatted to earlier who inherited a project from us who had a very early version of this. So I do apologize. The later version is better, and does work really well for us. It's something that we've written where you model your Sitecore changes in JSON. So this gives you real freedom as to how granular the changes you want to make are. You can just deal with updating just a single field, or you can deal with updating every single field in the database in one go. So because it's all running in JavaScript, you can iterate through databases. So the bottom loop we can see is providing us that ability that we can say, right, we're going to iterate through all our publishing targets and run the changes into each. So then you don't even need to worry about doing a publish, which is quite a nice thing. One change we've brought in recently is that because we're dealing with multiple pods, and a pod we think of as being a publishing target, we can actually install this stuff simultaneously on each pod. So therefore, when we deploy the Sitecore content changes as part of our deployments, we don't even need to publish to anywhere, and they're all updating at the same time. That does come with some challenges. You've got to be able to make sure that if for some reason it goes wrong on one of the pods, how do you handle that? But that tends not to be the problem. The issues tend to happen around misconfigurations and things like that. And so what we found is it's meant we can create these really simple little change sets that give us a huge amount of power, because we can iterate, we can deal with anything that the Sitecore API allows us. Because really what this is doing is it's calling into the Sitecore API under the hood. And finally, I think what I was hoping to get across today is that Sitecore developers, I think, can be very, very good at this sort of thing. Ultimately, before doing this, I knew nothing really about the sort of deployment or monitoring process. And at the end of it, then we got to the place where EasyJet is out there in the wild and working for us. So as Obama says, yeah, we can. Good on him. If only he was back. And finally, thanks to these guys, they allow this sort of thing to happen. If you want to get in touch, drop us an email, have a look on my blog. There are blog posts about some of these sorts of things, and yeah, trying to add interesting ones all the time. And if anyone's got any questions, then I'd say now's the time to shout. Thanks. All right.
You mentioned about your pods and the kind of setup of the server and the database, right?
Yeah.
How does that fit into the diagram that you showed early on in the presentation when you showed all your server infrastructure? Because I could see a list of the web servers, but I wasn't sure what part was a pod in relation to that picture.
So we think of a pod as being almost like a set of content delivery entities. So it'll be 2 web servers and 1 SQL server, which maps to a publishing target in Sitecore. And we've got 4 pods, 2 in Frankfurt and 2 in Dublin. So it gives us a few advantages. One is resiliency, because if Dublin goes, we've still got Frankfurt and vice versa. We've got the fact that if availability zone in Frankfurt goes, we've still got the other one. And we can kind of do crude A/B testing. We can push content just to Frankfurt or just to pod 1, and therefore only a subset of the users will see that. So users are sticky to a pod. That's the one constraint we put in.
Well, remember you mentioned when EasyJet releases new routes and you do both, so blue-green, you like double them.
So the question was, yeah, when we get new routes in and we double up the infrastructure, how do we do it? Is that a good summary of it?
Give more explanation, please.
So we have green running, and green will be 4 pods, and that's up in production at a point in time. So what we do is we take a copy of the databases, and then we create the counterpart color. So we then got 8 pods. And what we do is we split users evenly across all 8 rather than all 4. And so that's done through Akamai. So then we've got, in theory, not 12 bits of kit, we've got 24 bits of kit, which gives us double capacity. Does that explain the?
This is something I suspected to hear from you.
Yeah. And we're lucky because we haven't got constraints around licensing for the number of nodes we have. So. Cool.
Cut you off here.
No worries. Well, thank you.